Now, despite the TrimUI Smart Pro being in a completely different price bracket to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, there are actually a lot of similarities between these two little wonders. So I thought it might be interesting to compare them and to see if one of them might actually be preferable and a bit of a surprise to you. Although the TrimUI Smart Pro has certainly got some drawbacks, I think there are more positives out there as well for some people to discover, whereas we know the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an absolute beast. Alright then, let's start with the design. In terms of styling, these two look moderately similar. The TrimUI Smart Pro has a more rounded edge on each side, whereas the Retroid Pocket 4 has a more rectangular with those still rounded edges on the corners. In the hand, the Smart Pro is very nice. It has that tactile matte finish paint, which I absolutely love. You won't see any fingerprints on here, and it's just touchable. You kind of want to stroke it. The Retroid Pocket 4 is no slouch either. It has a more grainy paint texture. It's not quite as strokeable, but it's certainly more grippy. It's also ever so slightly thicker. That's not to say it's a thick boy, being just over 1 centimeter in thickness, but it does give you a little more to hold on to. Neither of the devices, though, is quite as comfortable as some of the rivals. Once you've held something like a Steam Deck in your hands, you really know how good the ergonomics on a handheld can be, but obviously that's much larger. In these small PSP-sized devices, there are certain trade-offs that you kind of have to accept. What I will say though is the ergonomics of the triggers on the Retroid Pocket 4, they feel fantastic. There's a small amount of textured grip on the back of them, they've got great travel, good resistance, and when you put them next to the TrimUI Smart Pro, which has arguably the worst triggers I have ever felt in my whole life, they really stand out as a selling point. Now, on the subject of the TrimUI, I'm not entirely sure what they were thinking with these. It almost feels like they're broken. If you look at the angle with which they move, there's nothing there. They almost flex from a point that they shouldn't, and it just means they're not great. They feel like an afterthought, and I guess the only positive here is that they're lower profile. Now, one final point on the overall thickness and design of both of these, I will say the TrimUI Smart Pro actually sits better on a desk. I know that's a strange thing, but due to the back of it being more flat, it sits flat, whereas the other sits at an angle and makes filming a bit of a pain because you have to stuff hidden things underneath it. That might be a factor for some people. If you're sliding this into like a laptop bag or something similar, you're much less likely to damage something that's completely flat. Both devices have a space for a micro SD card slot and an SD card hopefully to go in there, and both also have a 3.5mm headphone jack. Neither of these has an easily removable battery, and then we've got the battle of the D-pads. Now, I actually love the D-pad on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but I think I equally love the TrimUI's D-pad. It just feels fantastic. If you're someone that plays predominantly D-pad based games, I think you'll get on really well with it. And then you have the analog sticks. Now, the analog sticks on the Retroid Pocket 4, they're okay by default. Yeah, I don't like them actually. I find the edges of them to be a little sharp, I find them uncomfortable, and as you can see, I have decked mine out with some nice grippy tops that make them significantly more comfortable to use. Also, due to the small nature of the device, you will find yourself bunching your thumbs up a little to get good purchase on them. And I know someone's going to say, where do I get those thumbstick covers from? Well, unfortunately, I didn't buy these separately. They came with another controller. It was actually an Android phone controller. Now, although I didn't necessarily love the analog sticks here, they're still actually very functional. They have good range of motion. There's good resistance here, and there's also good granularity in terms of dead zones. They just work very well. Then when you look at the TrimUI Smart Pro, the analog sticks are borderline unusable. They're a joke. I don't know what they were thinking here. These aren't your traditional analog stick, in fact. Was it the 3DS? I can't remember. One of them had one of those really strange analog sticks that was almost like a little nub that you moved around. That's what this feels like. It doesn't roll over. It slides left and right within a really small window of movement. And in fact, my device at least seems to have some issue whereby it's constantly going to the right. So much so that even if I tweak my dead zones, I have to fight it to get any kind of control. It's just a joke. It adds insult to injury, and I might actually return this one to try and get a new one because it feels defectively bad. The actual ends of these analogs are rubbish. They are just terrible. So small, you'll find your thumbs sliding off all over the place. So yeah, if you can avoid using them at all costs, just avoid them. The only saving grace for those people that like flashy lights is that they have LEDs in them. Yeah. Now, the face buttons on the right hand side, the Retroid Pocket, they've used a, again, slightly tactile feeling paint there, and that feels nice. Gives a little resistance. a little bit of something to grip onto. And the TrimUI, there's nothing wrong with those either. They're fine, even if they feel a little bit cheaper. When it comes to aesthetics and styling, obviously they're slightly different in terms of their design. One's translucent and the other one's opaque. But you've probably seen on the channel, I'm a big fan of these white devices. But I think the translucent does look lovely. Also, just being able to look inside, it's quite an interesting design in terms of the components within it. I think it's laid out nicely, and it also makes diagnosing issues a little bit easier. On that subject, I haven't had any problems in terms of build quality with the Retroid Pocket, and I definitely can't say the same with the TrimUI. But then we get on to really what is, let's be honest, the most important part, and that's what can you play, how does it play, and how does it look and sound. Now, the screens on both of these are actually reasonably large. You can see the specs right there, and clearly the much brighter screen of the Retroid Pocket 4 gives it the edge in terms of screen quality, I think. The TrimUI is no slouch, but it's noticeably dimmer, even at its maximum brightness setting. With that said though, I still do quite like the look of it, and I believe the screen is ever so slightly larger. Now obviously these two devices are running completely different OSs. The Retroid running Android means that you can customize to a much greater degree. You've got Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the highest versions of those things, whereas the TrimUI is coming with a custom version of Linux. And actually I do like the operating system here. It gives you easy access to a lot of options with an almost Sony-esque back-end theme. It's quite slick actually. So let's get down to business with the gaming side. Firstly, when we're looking at two more easy to run games, well, I think actually they both handle it quite well. The volume also on both of these devices gets more than loud enough, although again, the quality is a little better on the Retroid. N64 is able to run mostly flawlessly across the board. You'll have the occasional quirk and stutter. It's funny because Linux seems to handle some things a little better, whereas Android, with all its processes in other areas running in the background, you might find yourself cranking it up to performance mode, which inherently means it's going to be much louder. Surprisingly though, the TrimUI Smart Pro can handle PS1, N64, and also Dreamcast quite well. And for a lot of people, that's going to be as far as they want to go. When you can run your Mega Drive, your SNES, all your arcade cabinets, and up to Dreamcast at a good frame rate, that's actually a very appealing device, particularly at this price point. And when you have those two prices right there in front of you, you've got to wonder, do you want to pay that extra? And if it was me personally, it would be a definite yes, and here's why. Firstly, the Android system means I can run a number of different themed operating systems. It's much easier to get my games onto the device. It's a lot easier to use things like those low latency aptX Bluetooth headphones and headsets. I've got Wi-Fi, so I can easily pair, and I can also screen share, but I also like to run higher end games. Things like GameCube, PSP, the Wii, the DS, and I do a lot of cloud streaming as well, so streaming from my Steam-based consoles and my PC. It's just more versatile. The gaming performance of those platforms as well is excellent. The specs here, they might not be absolute top tier, but they're more than good enough, and at the price they're asking, those specs are actually incredibly good. If you compare that to a mobile phone with the same specs, you're going to be paying far above that. Now, with all of this said, I do still feel there is a place for the TrimUI. I absolutely love the way it feels in the hand. If they could release a new model that was slightly higher in terms of specs, that could go up to, I don't know, something like GameCube, or at least to comfortably run PSP and maybe PS2, then yeah, it would be an incredibly good device. Switch out those analog sticks as well, please, and those triggers, but keep the overall shape and form factor. It feels nice in the hand. And as far as more budget handheld devices go, being able to run up to Dreamcast, it's impressive and it's enjoyable to use, as long as you stay away from the analog stick. But if you can afford to push your budget higher, I know for $150 you can get the normal Retroid Pocket, and it's definitely worth that. If you can do it, do it. You're going to get so much more for your money. I think you'll feel more satisfied as a customer just being able to run almost everything. Even with the lower spec Retroid Pocket 4, with a few tweaks and tinkering, you can run almost anything. The higher RAM is beneficial for me because of the games that I like to play on the Pro model. But yeah, a little comparison, and I think surprising in terms of actually what you can get for your money. And both of these are good value, but one of them is noticeably better. So that's it for this episode. As I always like to say, if you enjoyed the content, stick around, and for everyone else, make sure to hit continue. See you on the next one.